For the Correlate Sermon Series, I've updated the rubric and expanded it for this year's group that we're working with. I felt like in the last few years, the evaluation piece has kind of been lacking and not as robust as it could be. And so I wanted to expand some of those pieces, add some pieces that haven't been considered in prior years. That are always part of the performance of a sermon. And then also to clarify some of the language. There were several categories that weren't always easily distinguished between. They seemed very similar. And so it was kind of difficult to figure out exactly what the difference was between those. In addition to that, I've also expanded it for the numbering system, 1 being the lowest, 7 being the highest, rather than 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. Part of that is because most of the time I noticed that 3 to 5 was the range that people used to evaluate. And so 3 was typically the very lowest that somebody would go. Here, at least there'll be a little bit more difference between the evaluation for students. So it gives you a few more categories to work with. 7 being excellent, 4 being sort of middle of the road or not sure, and then 1 being needs a lot of development. So just thinking along those categories and having a couple of additional points that you can work with between the middle of the road and the upper and lower parts of that Likert scale, excuse me. In addition, there were 5 categories that were utilized in the previous rubric, and I've expanded those to biblical content, which was in the last one, congregational context, which was also in the last one, and then added some different categories beyond that that draw from some of the previous rubric, but then also, again, have some different language and kind of expand it a little bit. 1 being performance and embodiment. One thing that we want to be careful in this particular category is recognizing that there are differently abled bodies and also different cultures that will embody differently. So just taking into context and thinking more along the lines of what's appropriate for that context and how natural it is for the person that's preaching as they're engaging that. And also just thinking about the environment and space. So not only the voice and hand gestures and physicality, but also how they utilize the space. Those kinds of things are important. Then the rubric shifts to focus on the preacher, to utilize the language of Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message, and so you can't divorce the preacher from the message. They are part and parcel of the message. And so looking at 3 different categories for the preacher to take into consideration. First is the pathos of the preacher. So thinking along the ways we would think of charisma, I do want to be careful in how we think about that. Charisma has typically been exuberant and powerful and often very masculine in its approach. I don't mean that. What I mean by pathos is the demonstration that this is something that the student, the preacher, is invested in, that they care a lot about, and that they are being evocative in the way that they bring others along in that journey. They invoke, they inspire, or evoke and inspire from others response. And so, again, trying to be careful. Again, we don't want it to be coercive, but the energy that a person brings to that task is important. It can be a quiet energy. It doesn't have to be extroverted. It can be very introverted. But even in that, there can be some real strong depth of passion that comes through, even in those that are soft-spoken and gentle in their approach. So the pathos, the passion that one brings to the task. Next is the ethos, or the sort of ethical piece of this. So how does the preacher embody this in the sermon? Is their actions running counter to what they're preaching? So if they're preaching about love and yet their embodiment of it, or the way that they're preaching it, is domineering, obviously that runs counter. And so how is the character, the humility, those kinds of things coming into consideration for the way that a preacher embodies the sermon or preaches the sermon. And then the last one is the logos of the preacher, the words that are used, the phrasing, the way it's structured, embodied language, imagistic language, language that is invitational, those kinds of things. So how is language utilized in ways that are engaging and considerate of the context and those kinds of things? So just to go back briefly through it, and to highlight a few notes to make clear what I mean by some of these categories. So under biblical content, that should be fairly understandable. So starting off with orients the congregation to the situation and setting of the biblical text. Here, we're not necessarily wanting them to unpack all of the exegetical work that they've done, but really what are the things, the key pieces that helps a congregation understand enough that they need to know to understand or have interpretive keys for understanding that text. The situation and setting could be within the story itself, setting up the story, or the other pericopes that surround that text, if that's helpful. Thinking of like Luke's story about the lost son, the lost coin, etc., the lost sheep. Those might be a pericope that you are only focusing on one, but the other three might be, or the other two might be important for giving setup, or it could be situation setting sort of behind the text. But you don't have to necessarily do all of those, but just what helps a congregation to be oriented, have enough interpretive keys that they can understand what the text is doing or saying. Next, the sermon structure is appropriate for the literary form of the text. There's a couple of different ways you can look at that. One would be to actually mirror what the sermon text does, like a chiasmus or something like that. Or is it, and I think this is probably where I lean a little bit more for most things, and it can be both and, but the sermon structure is trying to replicate in some way what the text does. So for instance, if somebody preaches a parable, but they're using a very didactic sort of teaching kind of approach to it, that sort of undercuts what a parable is intended to do. A parable takes you through a journey by immersing you in a story and sort of flipping things on its head, rather than a sort of didactic piece. Jesus uses both in that. He uses the parable and then goes to the didactic. That's fine. But making sure that the sermon structure is at least trying to replicate in some way what the sermon or the literary form of the text is doing. So again, like a psalm, it would be very appropriate for the sermon to include poetry and imagery and those kinds of things. So again, trying to model or imitate in some kind of way what a sermon structure is doing that allows the biblical text to live again, breathe again, and to in some ways perform in the same ways that it did for its maybe original audience to some degree, as much as that can be ascertained. Then moving towards the sermon adequately names the human condition in the text. Paul Scott Wilson calls this the problem in the text. What is the crux, the issue? Where's the problem that's trying to be resolved in this text? And here the human condition, by that I mean, what are the things that all people have struggled with in some way? So the human condition in the text, do they name that adequately? And is it in balance with other pieces of the text, or the sermon, excuse me? And then the sermon proclaims the good news of the text. Is there good news that comes out of this? Are they able to name that in the biblical text and draw that out? And is that good news rooted in what God is doing and not necessarily what we are doing or what the people are doing per se, but how is God's good news active in this text? And then again, this kind of reiterates this, but I think takes it a little bit further. And here I'm looking a little bit more towards the end of the sermon, especially. The sermon appropriately names the grace of God in the text. In the sermon, I really think we need to be moving back towards a theocentric place, back towards who God is, what God has done, either in a redemptive past or in a liberative future. But that grace of God in the text is where we land. Not that way we avoid things like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of theology. So Is God being named? Is God's action being named? Then moving to the congregational context, does the sermon address congregational barriers to new perspectives? Buttrick calls this congregational blocks, but what are going to be the things that are maybe sort of implicit or explicit biases that the congregation holds that need to be addressed in order for there to be a hearing? And usually you can find out what those are by saying, what are the sacred cows that people hold dear in this particular congregation? Can they be named, or at least they addressed? Jesus does that a couple of different ways. One, he says, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. That's addressing a congregational block very directly. In parables, Jesus draws out those kind of barriers by actually switching and going kind of around it and avoiding the initial question to really get at the heart of something. So it doesn't necessarily always need to be direct, but are those congregational barriers being addressed? And then speaks to present social and communal realities, challenges. This could be a small scale social, so local church, local community, family, or it could be larger scale, national, global. What are those realities and challenges, and how are they being engaged in the congregation? And I think to some degree, do those realities and challenges, are they connected with the congregation? So, no use to address a situation challenge that doesn't really apply to them. Sermon connects the biblical world with our world. And here we're thinking contextual translation. So does the biblical world have parallels, bridges that help us understand our world and some of the challenges within it? Does it help us to reframe how we understand our world? And then the sermon proclaims hope for our present moment, fears, and anxieties. So for the congregation, again, trying to think about what helps move them, inspiration, that kind of thing. Ultimately, I think hope is where we kind of want to land. Even in a prophetic word, it moves towards that. So it begins to at least address those fears that are present, the anxieties that are present in a congregation. And then the sermon points to specific ways to see God working in our world. So in the previous category, it was pointing it to how is God working in the text? And now we're trying to help people see how God is active currently in the world. So beginning to build those bridges, helping them to see not simply God as past, but God also as present and future. And then moving towards performance and embodiment. So just a couple of notes. I know that some of these sermons will be done by camera, and so things like eye contact may not be feasible because there won't be any congregation present there. So the main thing I'm thinking on these is what would be appropriate for sort of any sort of setting, assuming that the camera kind of is the audience. So when somebody's preaching, that the main thing is we're not like watching the top of their head the whole time as they're speaking, those kinds of things, so that they're making an effort to connect. So eye contact, being able to see, the face, that kind of thing. Appropriate gestures, movement, matching the communication, again, taking into consideration that different bodies can do different things, are limited in other kinds of ways. So here I'm thinking about how your gestures actually match what you're doing and what you're saying. So a great example is I saw a sermon where the preacher would do this the whole time. And when you're doing this the entire time, it begins to feel like you're sort of explaining everything. Like, why don't you get this? Come on, get it. Like a parent to a child, if you would just come on. And it was a very encouraging message, but the way that embodiment in that particular context and culture could be understood as sort of like, come on, get it already. So are the gestures and movements that are being utilized, do they match what's being said and communicated? And then appropriate use of spatial environment and setting. Again, I know a camera will probably limit what they can do in terms of movement and all those kinds of things, but space is still important. So how do they use that space If it's a big cavernous kind of place, that might mean they have to slow down their talking because of echoes, those kinds of considerations. So how do they use the space and use their embodiment in that space? Some of it may even be liturgical space. How do they incorporate that stuff in? Those can be all part of that consideration. And then varies voice, tone, and speed throughout the sermon. Again, it will be different for different people. An East Coast person will speak much faster than a Midwest person, and that's appropriate and fine. Here, I'm just thinking, does it seem natural? Are they constantly like trying to catch their breath because they're going too fast? You can't keep up, that sort of thing. So are they able to pause, create effect, allow people to be drawn in with them? Do they allow for moments of crescendo and descending, all those kinds of things? So does it help create interest with the way they use their speed and tone that's appropriate for the context and for them, and feels natural? And then appropriate facial expressions matching communication. Again, obviously, if you're talking about grace and forgiveness all the time and you've got a scowl on your face, that probably kind of runs counter. So just making sure that facial expressions are part of that communication. And again, taking into consideration that, again, different bodies will do different things. We want to take that into consideration as part of that. Then moving to the pathos of the preacher. Here again, kind of some of the intangibles. Those are hard to measure, but how does the pathos of the preacher impact the sermon, the delivery, and all those kinds of things, and even engagement with the congregation relationally? So they demonstrate passion for the message. And that doesn't necessarily mean they yell louder, but they're invested in this message. Their communication inspires or encourages the congregation to respond in some way, and the preacher's demeanor shows conviction. They demonstrate relational connection with the congregation, and they're relaxed, inviting body posture, and again, recognizing differently abled bodies and posture can be construed a lot of different ways. But essentially, how are they relating with the congregation? How are they utilizing energy and passion and conviction as part of that in ways that inspire, encourage, enliven, energize, or even make contemplative and reflective or pensive and maybe lamenting, but they're able to help lead people into those kinds of moments. And then moving to the ethos of the preacher. Here, they demonstrate pastoral sensitivity to the congregation. So are they able to say something that's the right word at the right time? Are they able to do even a hard word in a caring, generous kind of way that brings life and is not just simply about destruction of something? Employs invitational rather than coercive, shaming communication. And so that can be done a lot of different ways, whether it's through language or embodiment or tone. But essentially, the way that they're preaching is not trying to force somebody or get somebody right on board the way they need to be, but helping to bring people along, invite them in. So then moving a little bit further, embodies the message of the sermon. This could be a little bit difficult to assess because we're not around them every week. But does there seem to be a real lived kind of reality behind what they're saying, as much as we can ascertain that? Or do they seem to be sort of talking beyond what their own experience has been, which isn't always bad. But if it's clear that what they're talking about is beyond the scope of their own practice, there's something that's disconnected in terms of the preaching and practice of the pastor that becomes concerning in some way, and it pulls from the message. The preacher displays integrity, honesty, and humility in the message. And so here, are they able to treat even people who have different viewpoints in generous kinds of ways, charitable kinds of ways? Are they, not necessarily, if they use like an illustration from their own lives, they're not like centering themselves in the sermon, those kinds of considerations. So are they able to consider others and how they're preaching? And then demonstrates preparedness for the sermon. This does not necessarily mean that they are have a purely written out document that they stay stuck to or anything like that. That could be the case, and that's fine. But preparedness, you can tell in terms of they've done the diligent work of the exegesis of the text, exegesis of the context, and then exegesis of themselves. Have they really paid attention internally what's going on and how they're communicating and all that? And so we would call it the work of prayer. So it just demonstrates that they have been working to prepare for this moment and have been diligent in that. And then the logos of the preachers, the words that are utilized. And here we start with the contextual language and vernacular. Academic theological language is great, but it can be distracting in certain settings. So are they able to take those concepts and that language and put it into the language that people are using on an everyday basis? Are they able to translate that for them to something that they would recognize? They use present tense language instead of a lot of passive language. This helps, I think, in making God present rather than just sort of a historical reality that we're reading these texts. These texts come alive now and not just simply in the past. And so present tense language can be really important in doing that. Uses imagistic and emotive language, embodied language. So here again, thinking along the lines that we're not just talking sort of academically and 30,000 feet up in the air, but are we able to give flesh and bone to it? Emotive language, using the senses, sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch. Are we able to use images that come from life that they would recognize and that can help evoke experience that they can relate with? They use appropriate metaphors and examples for the context. And again, that kind of goes a little bit back to that previous one, but also expands it. The examples and metaphors can be certainly biblical, but do they match the context? And so metaphors and examples of agriculture may work really well in certain rural settings, but they may really fall flat in extremely urban centers. And so trying to find ways that metaphors match the context. And then sermon flow was clear and easy to follow. Here I'm thinking of sermon structure. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one clear sermon idea. That's one way of approaching that. But here I'm thinking more along the lines, are they able to take the congregation, the listeners, hearers, on a journey from where they open up the text or open up with that initial image or metaphor or story, and then move them through so that they experience God throughout that entire thing, but also it's connected. And so there's a clear sort of cognitive logic to it. It makes sense all the way through, but there's also an emotive logic that helps bring people through on this journey that they stay engaged with. And so paying attention to both those things, is there an easy flow that helps people stick with the preacher throughout the sermon? And then the final category is just an open category for additional comments and concerns that may not necessarily find themselves in the categories above. So for instance, one that I tend to pay attention to is, how does a preacher pay attention to marginalized voices, or do they totally ignore them? How do they use power? There may be other kinds of elements that are distractions perhaps, or bad habits maybe, like the sermon, they were chewing gum the whole time, and so it was kind of hard to catch what they were saying between the smacking of the gum. I don't know, but that might just be a way for noting some things that were either super distracting, or maybe some theological things that were really problematic for the way the text was interpreted. You name it, you can add some of those things in there. And then you can add some point deductions. Now, I would not add points to a score. These are mainly just some things to note. I mean, you can add positive comments, but you may deduct some points for some of the negative things that happened that you weren't able to take apart from up above. But that way everybody has the same amount of points for all the categories rather than adding in. And you have some leeway here. I would probably stay in the 5 to 7 point range and not go above that in any deductions, because that would essentially be about as much as you would take away from a category above. But that does give you a little bit of additional points to utilize for grading up or down certain sermons if that's helpful. And then at the very bottom, you'll have the total score for the sermon that you'll add up for all these categories. And again, 1 being the lowest, 7 being the highest. All right. Well, I hope the rubric is clear. I hope it'll be helpful to be a little bit more, I think, a little bit more rigorous in our evaluation and how we parse out and even communicate with students additional ways that they can continue to grow and expand in their preaching. If you have any additional questions, I'm always happy to have conversation and talk through some of this, but hope it's helpful.